June 8th, year 793. The sky above the North Sea is grey, and the monks of Lindisfarne are about to meet something they cannot explain. The bells ring not for prayer, for warning. Long black shapes cut through the fog, not traders, not pilgrims, men with axes, and within hours, Europe will believe the end of the world has begun. But were these men truly demons from the north? Or were they something far more dangerous, something human? The land that shaped them was not kind. Scandinavia in the 8th century was fragmented. No unified kingdom, no empire, only chieftains, farms, and ambition. Archaeology from sites like Hedeby shows thriving trade networks before major raids even began, if they were starving barbarians. Why do we find silver from Baghdad? If they were primitive, why were their ships superior to most European vessels? Recent isotopic analysis of Viking remains suggests mobility across vast regions, including connections to the Abbasid Caliphate. They were already connected to the world, they just hadn't terrified it yet. Monasteries were soft targets, wealth without walls, gold without swords. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described the attack as heathen men miserably destroyed God's church. But let's pause. Were monasteries innocent victims or political symbols of expanding Christian authority? History often frames the Vikings as villains, but we must remember monasteries stored wealth extracted from local populations. To a Scandinavian raider, this was not sacrilege, it was strategy. The Vikings didn't just burn Lindisfarne, they shattered psychological security. But here is the twist. The men who raided Lindisfarne were not yet Vikings. That word did not describe a people, it described an activity. To go Viking meant to raid. This was not a nation attacking Europe. It was entrepreneurs of violence, and that changes everything. Focus shifts to longships, clinker-built hulls, flexible planks, shallow draft. They could cross oceans, navigate rivers, land directly on beaches without them. No Viking Age. Recent experimental archaeology has reconstructed ships like the Gokstad vessel, proving open ocean capability. How did they navigate without compasses? Did they use sunstones? Research suggests Iceland's spar may have helped locate the sun under cloud cover. Fear spreads. Charlemagne is dead. His empire fractured. England divided into small kingdoms. Opportunity. Raids escalate into seasonal campaigns, then overwintering, then settlement. The shock of Lindisfarne becomes pattern, and pattern becomes transformation. The realization dawns across Europe. This is not apocalypse, this is adaptation. The Viking Age has begun, but not because they were unstoppable, because Europe was divided. Lindisfarne marks the conventional beginning of the Viking Age. But history is rarely that neat. What began as a raid became trade networks, cultural exchange, genetic integration, political transformation. Modern DNA studies show Viking ancestry across Britain, Ireland, and even Southern Europe. They did not merely burn Europe, they reshaped it. They came in silence across cold water and left behind a new world. But the true weapon of the Vikings was not fear. It was wood, wind, and water. Before the axe, before the fire, before the screaming at Lindisfarne, there was a ship, a long, narrow body of oak and iron, flexible, fast, silent. It did not look like an empire, but it carried one. How did a society with no centralized state build the most advanced naval technology in Europe? And why did no one else see it coming? Scandinavia was not agriculturally rich, rocky soil, short summers, limited surplus. So wealth had to move, and moving wealth required mobility. Archaeological excavations of the Gokstad ship and Osberg ship revealed something shocking. These were not crude boats. They were precision-engineered vessels, clinker-built planking, iron rivets, overlapping hull boards for flexibility. Modern reconstruction trials showed these ships could reach speeds of 15-20 knots under ideal wind conditions that rivals many medieval vessels centuries later. Why overlapping planks instead of flat? How could they survive North Atlantic storms? Who funded such craftsmanship? Experimental archaeology conducted by Scandinavian maritime historians has proven that longships flex with waves rather than resisting them. Flexibility prevented catastrophic hull failure. In other words, they didn't fight the sea, they adapted to it. I believe this reflects something deeper about Viking society. They were not reckless brutes, they were adaptive strategists. Unlike most European ships, longships had shallow drafts. They could sail open ocean, enter rivers, land directly on beaches, retreat quickly. That single design advantage allowed them to bypass fortified ports entirely. They didn't attack gates, they appeared behind them. How did defenders prepare against enemies who could appear anywhere? Was Europe technologically behind or strategically complacent? We assume navigation requires magnetic compasses, but compasses didn't reach Europe widely until later, so how did Vikings reach Iceland? Greenland? Possibly North America? Enter the sunstones. Research suggests Iceland's spar, a type of calcite crystal, may have helped detect polarized sunlight through cloud cover. Although debated, experimental testing has shown it could work. But even without sunstones, Vikings relied on oral route memory, bird migration observation, ocean current patterns, wave direction recognition. These were not guesswork sailors. They were environmental readers. But here is what most people misunderstand. The longship was not designed for conquest. It was designed for connection before it carried raiders. It carried traders. Arab silver coins discovered in Sweden prove deep trade networks stretching to the Abbasid Caliphate. The Viking world was plugged into global commerce. The ship was not born in violence. It was repurposed for it. Now escalate westward, sailing beyond sight of land. The North Atlantic is merciless, freezing spray, rogue waves, ice. Yet around 870 AD, Norse settlers reached Iceland. Then Greenland, then possibly Vinland. Archaeological confirmation came in the 1960s at Landsox Meadows. Carbon dating confirmed Norse presence in North America centuries before Columbus. This was not myth, it was migration. Why didn't Vinland survive? Did climate change play a role? Were these explorations strategic or desperate? Shift eastward. The same ships sailed down Russian river systems. They reached the Black Sea. They reached Constantinople. The Varangian Guard elite Viking warriors served Byzantine emperors. Imagine that, men from icy fjords guarding the richest city in the world. The ship made that possible. Without it, there is no Viking expansion into Eastern Europe. No Kiu trade routes, no Scandinavian impact on early Russ identity. By now we see it clearly. The longship was a war platform, a migration vessel, a trade carrier, a cultural bridge, but more than that, it was mobility weaponized. Europe was static. The Vikings were fluid. That asymmetry reshaped the medieval world. The Viking longship influenced naval architecture, trade, logistics, military mobility, coastal defense systems. European kingdoms were forced to adapt. Fortifications changed, standing navies emerged. The shock of Lindisfarne was emotional, but the ship was structural, and structures change civilizations. It was not the axe that conquered Europe, it was the hull that carried it. But ships do not create legends, men do. If piglets knew what the old boar suffers. That is what the sagas claim Ragnar Lothbrok said before dying in a Northumbrian snake pit, a dramatic death, too dramatic, which raises the question, did Ragnar Lothbrok ever exist at all? By the ninth century, raids had intensified, England was fractured, Scandinavian warbands were gaining power, societies in transition often create legends. Ragnar appears primarily in later Icelandic sagas, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, the tale of Ragnar's sons, but here is the issue. These texts were written 200 to 300 years after the events they describe, which means we are not reading history, we are reading memory shaped by politics. Why would Icelandic writers create or embellish Ragnar? What political purpose would a unified heroic ancestor serve? Was Ragnar a symbol of pan-Scandinavian identity? Medieval historian Rory McTurk and others argue Ragnar may be a composite figure emerging of multiple Viking leaders into one narrative archetype. Possible historical inspirations include the Viking regent Harris who raided Paris in 845, a Danish king mentioned in Frankish chronicles, early Norse war leaders in England. In other words, Ragnar may be less a man and more a brand. In 845 AD, a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine and attacked Paris. Frankish records mention a Viking leader named Regent Harris. He demanded tribute. King Charles the Bald paid him silver to leave. Was Regent Harris Ragnar? Possibly, but the sagas inflate the story. In saga literature, Ragnar becomes unstoppable. In Frankish sources, he negotiates. The difference reveals something critical. Myth amplifies dominance. History records compromise. Here is where I lean cautiously. I do not believe Ragnar existed exactly as described. But I believe the memory of Ragnar served a powerful social function. He unified scattered raids into a narrative of destiny, and destiny is more powerful than fact. Enter Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and like Ragnar, these men likely existed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle documents the Great Heathen Army invading England in 865. The saga narrative says they invaded to avenge Ragnar's death. But here's the twist. Revenge is a powerful storytelling device. Political conquest is a more likely explanation, which sounds more heroic. We invaded for land and power. Or we invaded to avenge our father. Myth reframes ambition as honor. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Ragnar's legend may have been written during a time when Scandinavia was consolidating into kingdoms. A unified origin story strengthens legitimacy. Imagine you are a rising king in Norway or Denmark. What better way to claim authority than to descend from the greatest Viking who ever lived? Ragnar becomes political ancestry, and political ancestry becomes power. Why does Ragnar endure? Because he embodies fearlessness, tactical brilliance, defiance against king's acceptance of death in saga tradition. Ragnar laughs at death. This is critical. The Viking worldview prized reputation over longevity. To die well was more important than to live long. Ragnar's snake pit death dramatizes this ethos. Did Vikings truly seek death in battle? Or is that later romanticization? Archaeological burial evidence shows many Vikings died of mundane causes. The hyper-focus on heroic death may reflect literary exaggeration. Again, myth shapes memory. Fast forward to modern media. The TV series Vikings turned Ragnar into a global icon, but pop culture Ragnar reflects modern values. Individualism, anti-authoritarianism, personal destiny, we project ourselves onto him. Ragnar evolves with each generation. That is how myths survive. So, what is Ragnar? A historical king, a composite of raiders, a propaganda invention. Ragnar may not have existed as one man, but he existed as a force, a narrative force that shaped identity, politics, and memory across Scandinavia. Sometimes myth does more damage and more work than fact. The Great Heathen Army narrative, Scandinavian royal genealogies, modern Viking revival movements, pop culture identity. He is proof that storytelling is a form of power, whether he lived or not. Ragnar conquered history, but legends do not invade kingdoms, armies do. In the year 865, they did not come to raid, they came to stay. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls them the Great Heathen Army, but who were they really? And why did England nearly fall completely? England in the ninth century was not unified. It was divided into competing kingdoms. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex rivalries were constant. Power was unstable. This fragmentation was the Vikings' greatest ally. Was England conquered because Vikings were unstoppable? Or because England was divided? Did internal political weakness invite invasion? Recent historical scholarship suggests the Great Heathen Army was not one single army but a coalition of warbands. This implies coordination, strategy, planning. This was not chaos. It was organized expansion. The army captures York in 866. Northumbrian rivals attempt to retake it, but internal rivalry costs them. They die fighting each other. The Vikings win. York becomes Jorvik, not destroyed, transformed. Archaeology from York reveals Scandinavian-style housing, trade goods from across Europe, urban planning. This was not random destruction. It was settlement. Enter Ivar the Boneless. The sagas describe him as physically impaired yet tactically brilliant. Some theories suggest osteogenesis imperfecta. Others argue boneless was metaphorical, perhaps meaning flexible or strategic. How does a physically impaired leader command fear in a warrior culture? Intelligence can dominate where brute strength fails. The sagas claim this invasion was revenge for Ragnar's death, but here is the likely truth. This was opportunistic conquest. Revenge makes good poetry. Land makes better policy. The Vikings were transitioning from raiders to rulers. Mercia falls under pressure, puppet kings installed, political manipulation replaces pure violence. The Vikings understood something crucial. You do not always destroy a kingdom. Sometimes you control it. This marks a strategic evolution. Enter Alfred the Great, young, inexperienced. Facing a nearly unstoppable force, Wessex becomes the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom standing. Alfred initially loses, retreats, regroups. This is critical. Viking dominance was not absolute. Resistance adapts. In 878, Alfred confronts Viking forces led by Guthrum, Battle of Edington. This is the pivot. Alfred wins. Guthrum converts to Christianity. A treaty is signed, the Danelaw is established, England is divided, not conquered, but transformed. The Danelaw formalizes Viking rule over large parts of England. Legal systems blend, languages merge, place names change. This was no longer invasion, it was integration. The Great Heathen Army ended Northumbrian dominance, reshaped Mercia, forced military reform in Wessex, accelerated English unification. Ironically, Viking aggression helped create England. Without them, Alfred may never have unified resistance. Without Alfred, England may not exist as we know it. They came for vengeance, but they built a new order. But the Vikings were not only conquerors, they were farmers, traders, lawmakers. Vikings. The name probably conjures images of horned helmets, brutal raids, and a thirst for nothing but plunder. But what if I told you that's only a tiny, distorted piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle? Let's journey back in time, beyond the battlefield, to discover the real world of the Norse people. Viking society wasn't just a chaotic free for all, it was built on a surprisingly sophisticated structure. At the top were the jarls, the chieftains and kings who held power and wealth. Below them were the carls, the free people. This was the largest group, made up of farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, shipbuilders, and skilled artisans. They were the backbone of the Norse economy. At the bottom were the thralls or slaves, often captives from raids, but their status wasn't always permanent. So, how did they keep order? Through law, the Vikings had a complex legal system centered around a regional assembly called a thing. Here, free men gathered to settle disputes, make new laws, and pass judgment. An outlaw, someone cast out from society, faced a fate worse than death. And what about the women? Far from being passive figures, Norse women had rights that were unheard of in many other parts of the world at the time. They could own property, inherit land, run businesses, and even divorce their husbands, while their primary domain was the household, managing farms and finances. Sagas tell us of powerful shield maidens, women who chose the path of a warrior. The Viking economy wasn't just built on raiding, they were master shipbuilders and navigators, which made them incredible traders. Their longships, marvels of engineering, carried them not just to raid, but to trade goods like furs, amber, and walrus ivory for silver, spices, and silk from as far away as the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East. They established bustling trade towns like Hedeby and Birka, which were true cosmopolitan centers. Their culture was rich with art, poetry, and mythology. They were incredible storytellers, preserving their history and beliefs through epic poems and sagas. Their intricate wood carvings and metalwork show a deep appreciation for beauty and craftsmanship. They weren't just destroyers, they were creators, explorers, and pioneers. So the next time you think of the Vikings, remember the farmer, the lawmaker, the merchant, and the artist. The fierce warrior was just one part of a dynamic and influential society that shaped the course of European history. Before the longships, before the raids, before even Ragnar, there was a tree. Its name was Yggdrasil, and it held the universe together. Yggdrasil connected the nine realms, not metaphorically, cosmologically. This was not symbolic poetry for medieval Scandinavians, it was structure. Did Vikings truly believe the cosmos was fragile? How does belief in cosmic fragility shape human behavior? Enter Odin, one-eyed, cloaked, restless. Unlike all powerful gods of other traditions, Odin is incomplete. He sacrifices his eye for wisdom. He hangs himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain knowledge of runes. This is radical theology, a god who suffers to learn. Much of what we know about Odin comes from the poetic Edda and prose. Edda, recorded in 13th century Iceland by Christian scholars, which means we are reading pagan theology filtered through Christian scribes. This complicates everything. Odin feels less like a god of war and more like a god of existential anxiety. He seeks knowledge because he knows something terrifying. Even gods will die. Enter Thor, hammer-wielding defender of humanity. While Odin is cerebral and paranoid, Thor is direct and protective. Thor's hammer Mjolnir becomes one of the most common Viking symbols found in archaeological pendants. This was not decorative, it was devotional. Was Thor worship more common among everyday farmers than Odin worship among elites? Many scholars believe so. Thor represented stability. Odin represented elite warrior culture. Introduce Freyja. Half of slain warriors were said to go to her hall. Not all went to Valhalla. This complicates modern pop understanding. Afterlife was not singular, it was stratified. There was also hell, not fiery damnation, but cold, shadowed existence. The Viking afterlife system was plural and nuanced. Valhalla, Odin's hall. Warriors feast and fight daily, resurrecting each night. But pause. Why endless battle? Because they are preparing for Ragnarok. This is chilling. The ultimate reward for bravery is not peace, it is more war. Does belief in glorious death encourage risk taking? Did this theology make Vikings more willing to fight? Or is that romantic projection? Burial evidence shows not all Viking warriors were buried with weapons. The idea that every Viking dreamed of Valhalla may be exaggeration. Valhalla may have been an elite aspiration. They came back, not as raiders, not as pirates, but as an army. In 865 AD, something changed forever. The Vikings stopped knocking on England's shores. They came to stay. But here's the question historians still debate. Was this invasion revenge? Or something far more calculated? Tonight, we follow the force known as the Great Heathen Army and the moment England almost ceased to exist. Before 865, Viking activity in England was seasonal: quick strikes, coastal monasteries, loot, slaves, departure. But England itself was fractured, not one nation, but for rival kingdoms. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, they fought each other constantly. To the Vikings, this wasn't a united island, it was opportunity. Modern historians debate the army's size. Estimates range from 1,000 to perhaps 3,000 warriors, small by later medieval standards, massive by early medieval mobility. But this was not a spontaneous raid. Archaeological digs at Repton suggest a winter camp, permanent infrastructure. This was colonization. Who led this army? Were they sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, or is that legend? Why did England collapse so quickly? And how close did the Vikings come to total victory? Let's step inside 865. According to later sagas, the leaders were Ivar the Boneless Uba Halfdan Ragnarsson. The story says they invaded to avenge their father, Ragnar Lothbrok, supposedly executed by King Law of Northumbria. But here's the truth, there is no contemporary evidence Ragnar existed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the invasion. It does not mention revenge, my bias. Revenge makes for great saga poetry, but land, tribute, and political instability make for better military strategy. The army marches north. Northumbria is in civil war. Two kings fight for the throne. The Vikings seize York, then called York, in Norse. Within a year, Northumbria collapses. King La dies in battle. Later legend claims he suffered the blood eagle. Modern scholars widely doubt this ritual execution ever occurred, but symbolically. England has been pierced. East Anglia 869 King Edmund the Martyr refuses to submit. He is killed. Christian chroniclers later portray him as a saint to the Vikings. He was resistance eliminated. Mercia 874 Mercia collapses under pressure. A puppet ruler is installed. The Vikings are no longer raiders. They are kingmakers. What if the Great Heathen Army wasn't entirely Norse? Isotopic analysis of skeletons from Repton suggests mixed origins: Scandinavia, Ireland, even local Britons. This wasn't a single tribe, it was a coalition, a war machine absorbing talent. And here's the twist. Many Vikings didn't want endless war. They wanted farmland. By 870. Only one kingdom resists, Wessex, its young king. Alfred the Great. Alfred was not yet the Great. In fact, early battles go badly. The Vikings defeat him repeatedly. At one point, Alfred flees into the marshes of Athelney. England teeters on extinction. What separates a defeated king from a legendary one? Time. Adaptation and reform. Alfred does something radical. He learns from the Vikings. He builds fortified towns-burghs. He reorganizes military levies. He creates a navy. He negotiates when necessary. The result? A grinding stalemate. In 878, Alfred confronts Viking leader Guthrum at Edington. This is not just a battle, it is survival. Alfred wins. Guthrum converts to Christianity. The Treaty of Wedmore divides England. The north and east become the Danelaw. The south remains Anglo-Saxon. England is split, but not destroyed. The Vikings settle. They farm, they trade, they marry. Old Norse words enter English. Sky window law husband. Modern linguistic research suggests that up to 5% of common English vocabulary comes from Old Norse influence. This wasn't just invasion, it was integration. I don't see this as civilization versus barbarism. I see two adaptable systems colliding: Christian monastic culture, Norse warrior merchants, and out of conflict. A New England without the Great Heathen Army. There is no unified English kingdom. Ironically, Viking pressure forged England. The political unification of England, cultural blending, the rise of Alfred's dynasty, foundations for later English identity, and centuries later, Scandinavian DNA still runs through northern England. The Vikings didn't disappear, they became English. But England was only one chapter. The Vikings weren't just conquerors of monasteries and marshes. They would sail rivers into the heart of Europe, found kingdoms in Ireland, reach the Mediterranean, and one day, they would stand at the gates of Paris. Imagine waking up in medieval Paris to the sound of oars, not dozens, hundreds. In 845 AD, the Vikings sailed up the Seine and demanded a ransom from the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. He paid. 40 years later, they came back. But this time, Paris refused to kneel, and what followed would change the future of France and the Viking world itself. The empire of Charlemagne once stretched across much of Western Europe, but after his death in 814, it fractured. His grandsons divided the empire through the Treaty of Verdun 843. The result? Political instability, weak borders, rival kings, and rivers. To the Vikings, rivers were highways. The Seine became a corridor straight into the heart of Francia. The first major Viking assault on Paris was led, according to Frankish sources, by Ragnar Lothbrok. Again, the name is debated, but the event is not. In 845, Viking forces reached Paris and defeated Frankish troops. King Charles the Bald paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. This payment, known as Danegeld, set a dangerous precedent. It worked. But it also advertised weakness. My bias: paying invaders rarely buys peace, it buys their return. What happens when you reward a predator? You teach it the route. 40 years later, the Vikings returned, not a raid, a siege. Estimates suggest 300 ships and thousands of warriors. Their leaders included Sigfred Rollo. Paris was no longer defenseless. Its defense was led by Odo of Paris. Bishop Goslin. The city sat primarily on the Ladilla. Naturally defensible, two fortified bridges blocked Viking ships from passing. This was not going to be easy. The Vikings attacked the bridges relentlessly. They built siege engines. They hurled stones. They tried to burn the city. For nearly a year, Paris held. Disease spread. Food ran low. But morale did not break. Frankish chronicler Abbo of Saint-Germain describes the siege in vivid detail, though clearly biased in favor of Christian heroism. Still, archaeology confirms heavy fortification efforts. Paris had learned from 845. Then something shocking happened. Instead of crushing the Vikings outright, Emperor Charles the Fat negotiated. He paid them again, and even allowed them to sail further inland to raid Burgundy. Imagine defending your city for a year, only for your emperor to pay your enemy. This political failure weakened Carolingian authority permanently, and it elevated Odo, the defender of Paris, into a national hero. If your king will not protect you, who becomes king? After the siege, Odo was crowned king of West Francia. This marks a turning point. The old Carolingian dynasty was fading. Local military leaders forged in Viking resistance rose to power. In many ways, Viking pressure reshaped European political systems: decentralization, feudal militarization, castle building, terror forced innovation. One Viking leader stands out: Rollo. In 911, King Charles the Simple made a radical decision. He granted Rollo land in exchange for loyalty and defense against further Viking attacks. This land became Normandy. The Vikings became Normans. They converted to Christianity. They adopted French language and customs, but they did not lose their edge. Less than 150 years later, a Norman descendant, William the Conqueror, would invade England in 1066. The ripple effects of the siege of Paris would echo across centuries. The Vikings were not confined to Francia. They settled in Ireland. Dublin becomes a Norse trade hub, established roots deep into Russia via the Volga, and Dnieper served as mercenaries in Byzantium. The Varangian Guard reached the Mediterranean, even raiding parts of Spain and North Africa. They were not merely raiders, they were adaptive opportunists. Trade, war, diplomacy. The siege of Paris represents a pivot point. After 886, Europe changed strategy. Stone castles rose along rivers. Standing forces became more common. Naval defenses improved. The age of easy river raids was ending. By the 11th century, Viking identity itself transformed. They became Normans in France, Rus in Eastern Europe, integrated nobility in England. The Viking Age did not end in fire. It dissolved into assimilation. The Vikings did not lose. They evolved. And here is my personal take. the real power of the Vikings was never just violence. It was mobility. They exploited weakness faster than empires could reform. But when Europe adapted, the Vikings adapted too. That is why their legacy survived the weakening of Carolingian authority, the rise of feudal defensive systems, the birth of Normandy, the Norman conquest of England, long-term cultural fusion across Europe. Paris survived. But it was never the same, neither was Europe, by the time the Viking Age ended around 1066. Scandinavians were no longer outsiders. They were kings, dukes, guards, traders. The question is no longer, how did the Vikings terrorize Europe? But how did they become Europe? He held the bridge alone. English soldiers charged. One by one, they fell for a brief moment in 1066. The Viking Age refused to die, but before the year ended, 3 kings would fall, 2 invasions would collide, and Europe would change forever. This is the story of Stamford Bridge and the final breath of the Viking world. By the 11th century, Scandinavia was no longer the fragmented warrior frontier of the 8th century. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had kings. Christianity had taken root. Trade networks stretched from the Baltic to Byzantium, and one man briefly united much of the North Sea world. Cnut the Great by 1016, Cnut ruled England. By 1028, he ruled Norway. For a moment, the Viking dream of overseas dominion was real, but empires built on personal strength rarely survive their founder. After Cnut's death in 1035, his empire fractured. England passed back into Anglo-Saxon hands under Edward the Confessor, and when Edward died in January 1066, he left no clear heir. That vacuum would ignite the final Viking gamble. Who had the rightful claim to England? Why did Scandinavia believe it still owned the island? And how did 1066 become the most consequential year in English history? Enter Harald Hardrada. His name means hard ruler, and he was perhaps the last true Viking king. Before ruling Norway, Harald served in the Varangian Guard in Byzantium. He fought in the Mediterranean. He amassed wealth and battlefield experience. He was not a reckless raider. He was a hardened strategist. Harald claimed that a previous agreement between Cnut's heirs entitled him to England's throne. And he wasn't alone. He allied with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's new king. The stage was set. In September 1066, Harald sailed with an estimated 300 ships. He landed in northern England. At the Battle of Fulford, he defeated English forces. York submitted. Victory seemed within reach, but then came a move that changed everything. King Harald Godwinson marched his army nearly 200 miles north in record time. A forced march, exhausting, relentless. Surprise would be his weapon. Harald's army was caught off guard near Stamford Bridge. Many Vikings had left their armor on their ships. The battle erupted in chaos. English chronicles describe a massive Norse warrior holding the narrow bridge, cutting down attackers until he was killed from below by a spear thrust. Legend. Possibly, but the battle's outcome is certain. Harald Hardrada was killed reportedly by an arrow to the throat. Tostig died beside him. The Norwegian army collapsed. Of roughly 300 ships that arrived, perhaps only 24 were needed to carry survivors home. The Viking Age had suffered a mortal wound, but here's the twist. Harald Godwinson had barely celebrated his victory. When news arrived, another invasion had begun from the south, led by William the Conqueror, a descendant of Vikings. The irony is staggering. The man who would end Anglo-Saxon England was himself born from Viking settlers in Normandy. The Viking Age didn't end in defeat. It returned wearing armor forged in France. Harold marched south. Immediately, his army was exhausted. 2 weeks after Stamford Bridge, the armies met at Hastings. Harold was killed, likely by an arrow to the eye, though modern historians debate the exact cause. William triumphed, and with him, Norman rule reshaped England. French replaced Old English in court and law. Feudalism deepened. Castles spread across the landscape. The Viking story had come full circle from raiders to rulers. Was Stamford Bridge truly the end of the Viking Age? Historians debate this. Scandinavian kingdoms continued, trade flourished, but large-scale seaborne raids declined sharply after 1066. Europe had adapted. Stronger monarchies, stone fortifications, organized military systems, integrated Christian kingdoms. The environment that once rewarded Viking mobility had hardened. The Viking Age ended not because Scandinavians grew weaker, it ended because Europe became stronger and because the Vikings themselves changed. They converted, they settled, they married, they ruled. Violence became governance. Even after Stamford Bridge, Scandinavian influence remained in northern England. Norman knights, descendants of Vikings, ruled vast territories. The Varangian Guard continued serving Byzantine emperors. The genetic and linguistic legacy endured. Modern research in population genetics confirms Scandinavian ancestry remains prominent. In parts of Britain, the Viking Age was not erased, it was absorbed. The Vikings began as opportunistic raiders exploiting fractured kingdoms. They evolved into settlers, then dukes, then kings, and in 1066, the last great Viking king fell. But the world he helped create did not. The rivers were fortified, the kingdoms centralized. Europe was hardened by fire. If the Viking Age had never happened, England might not have unified, France might not have birthed Normandy, Russia might not bear the imprint of the Rus. Sometimes the end of an era is simply the beginning of something stronger, from the monasteries of Lindisfarne to the bridge at Stamford. 3 centuries of transformation. The Vikings did not just raid Europe, they reshaped it. And perhaps the greatest lesson they leave us is this: civilizations that adapt survive, those that don't become someone else's saga.